When it comes to worries about the economy, inflation is a guilty culprit. In 2021, inflation scares brought a series of false alarms to a lot of people. It's not fake news because it can possibly ring true. However, Twitter and Square CEO Jack Dorsey recently issued a dire economic prediction accompanied with the startling term hyperinflation. Quote-unquote, hyperinflation is going to change everything. It's happening. Dorsey tweeted on October 22. Later, in response to a follower's follow-up question, Dorsey added that hyperinflation will happen in the US soon, and so the world. Such a threatening announcement begs questions like, what is hyperinflation? Or simply, what's inflation? Well, today we're going to answer those questions, and we'll also talk about whether hyperinflation will happen in 2022. So stick around till the end of the video to find out. Hyperinflation is a term economists use to define a period of extremely high inflation, which determines the rate of rising prices for goods and services. Typically, an economy must see an inflation rate of greater than 50% for at least a month before economists use the hyperinflation label. At that rate, a loaf of bread could cost one amount in the morning and a higher one in the afternoon. When hyperinflation is in effect, consumer behavior adjusts. To keep from paying more for goods tomorrow, people begin hoarding today. That stockpiling creates shortages. Hoarding can start with durable goods such as automobiles and washing machines. If hyperinflation continues, people hoard perishable goods like bread and milk. These daily supplies become scarce and more expensive, and the economy falls apart. Inflation eats into real investment returns too. As the value of a dollar declines, investors need to earn more than their average return on investment in order to generate the same purchasing power. Moreover, people lose their savings as cash loses its value. For that reason, the elderly are often the most vulnerable to hyperinflation. Soon, banks and lenders go bankrupt because their loans lose value. They run out of cash as people stop making deposits. Hyperinflation sends the value of the currency plummeting in foreign exchange markets. The nation's importers go out of business as the cost of foreign goods skyrockets. Unemployment rises as companies fold. Government tax revenues fall and it has trouble providing basic services. The government prints more money to pay its bills, worsening the hyperinflation. According to Steve H. Hank, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, periods of hyperinflation are actually very rare. Furthermore, there were only 62 recorded episodes of hyperinflation in world history, and none of them ever took place in the United States. In one hyperinflation case that happened in Zimbabwe, they experienced hyperinflation between 2004 and 2009. The government printed money to pay for the war in the Congo. Also, droughts and farm confiscation restricted the supply of food and other locally produced goods. As a result, hyperinflation happened. The inflation rate was 90% a day and prices doubled every 24 hours. Today, the Zimbabwe dollar is no longer in circulation as the country continues to struggle with the issues that often lead to hyperinflation, such as an increased money supply, political corruption, and a major decline in economic activity. Unable to use its own currency, Zimbabwe now relies on foreign currencies like the US dollar and South Africa's rand as a medium of currency exchange. Even historically, stable country economies have experienced hyperinflation. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, the Weimar Republic of Germany fell into economic decline due to war reparation debts and significantly reduced economic activity. The German government printed too much money in an effort to handle its economic obligations and to ignite a stagnant economy. The country faced an inflation rate of 323% per month by November 1923. That's an annual inflation rate of 3 billion%. In today's dollar, the consumer impact of hyperinflation is particularly burdensome. For example, a cup of coffee that normally would cost $3 would cost $22 at a 1,000% inflation rate. Similarly, a rental payment for an apartment in a major US city might normally cost $2,000, but with a 1,000% inflation rate, that rent would cost $22,000. Hyperinflation also exists on the world's economic stage in 2021. Venezuela, for example, has an estimated inflation rate of 438%. You see, when a government pursues a high level of short-term economic spending at a rate significantly higher than the country's gross domestic product or GDP rate, more money flows through the economy. When that happens, the real value of a nation's currency declines, the price of goods and services rises, and inflation spikes. While figures linked to hyperinflation vary, some economists say hyperinflation occurs when the price of goods and services in a country's economy rise by 50% over the period of 1 month. As you can see, it's not in any way good at all. For context, the Labor Department's Consumer Price Index, which is a frequently used measure for inflation, has soared by 5.4% over the past 12 months. That's the greatest annual rate increase in the US since 2008, but it's still far below the threshold for hyperinflation. The highest US inflation rate of the past century came after World War II, when inflation jumped by nearly 20% in 1947 amid post-war supply shortages. So here comes the dreaded question: is hyperinflation really coming to the United States? Before we answer that, let's put a bit of attention on this first. Is inflation rising? Well, a bit. Consumer prices were falling last spring, so compared to this year's spring, prices have inflated. As for the longer term, the bond market's expectation of annual inflation over the next decade has shot up all the way to 2.15%. Indeed, the US inflation rates and the prices of many goods and services have increased. Going back to the first question, is hyperinflation coming to the United States? Well, it is hard to predict because the expectations of consumers and businesses play a big role in it. To some degree, prices will go up if people think they will go up and won't if they don't think so. In a series of papers beginning in 1986, Irving Fisher argued that expectations of the future inflation rate are influenced by observations of the past inflation rate. However, economists dismissed the notion that hyperinflation is approaching the country for several reasons. It's essential to remember that hyperinflation and inflation are two different things. Hyperinflation is a term to describe rapid, excessive, and out-of-control general price increases in an economy. While inflation is a measure of the pace of rising prices for goods and services, hyperinflation is rapidly rising inflation, typically measuring more than 50% per month. So inflation is somewhat possible. Hyperinflation, on the other hand, is unlikely. Many economists attribute inflation in America to ongoing inventory shortages and supply chain issues and the release of post-pandemic pent-up demand, though it remains unclear whether the inflation will linger in the short or long term. Even the largest inflation rate in the US history, which stands at 23% in June 1920, wouldn't come close to approaching hyperinflation levels of 50% in a month. Still, ongoing inflation is something that the US economy hasn't seen in more than 4 decades, and it's a risk that investors may want to consider when developing their portfolio strategy. So, as you may know, going back to Dorsey's claim, most economists have dismissed his talk as overly dramatic. David Rosenberg, an economist and president of Rosenberg Research, told CNBC's Trading Nation this week that the trend of rising prices in the US is simply due to supply chain issues brought on by the ongoing pandemic. The idea that the current inflation could grow to the point of hyperinflation, bringing down the US economy, is, according to him, totally ridiculous. Over the summer, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said that the period of elevated inflation in the US would be transitory or short-lived. Economists are confident that lawmakers and monetary policy makers will take the appropriate steps to rein in inflation, including tapering asset purchases and raising interest rates. Despite the close impossibility of hyperinflation, many people are still troubled by it. So if it did happen, what should you do? There are a couple of ways you can guard yourself from any kind of inflation. Sound financial habits would help you get through a period of hyperinflation too. First, be prepared by having your assets well diversified. You should balance your assets among US stocks and bonds, international stocks and bonds, gold and other hard assets, and real estate. Second, keep your passport up to date. You may need it if hyperinflation in your country makes your standard of living intolerable. While hyperinflation is certainly an economic condition any country would do to their utmost efforts to dodge, there's no convincing evidence signifying it's on the US economic horizon, neither now or anytime in the near future. Well, that's it for today's video. We hope you learned a lot from this, and if you did, hit the like and subscribe button. We'll see you in the next video.